Picture the skyline of São Paulo, Brazil. Skyscrapers rising into the clouds, the hum of a city that never slows down. Now, just imagine cutting away to the two logos that have ruled global skies for decades. Boeing on one side, Airbus on the other. These names aren't just brands, they're empires. Together, they've built a monopoly in the skies so strong that most airlines barely consider anyone else. And then, out of nowhere, a headline flashes. Total Aviation, a small Brazilian carrier, signs a deal for 4 Chinese-made jets. At first glance, it looks tiny, just 4 planes in a market of thousands. But here's the twist. In aviation, small cracks can grow into massive shifts. Think of it like the first drop of water leaking through a dam. The order is small, but the signal? It's enormous. Because for the first time in modern history, a South American airline didn't go with Boeing or Airbus. They chose China's COMAC, with its C919 jet, a plane designed to challenge the very foundations of aviation's old order. So, the question is simple, but huge. Why would a Brazilian airline pick a Chinese plane? And what does it mean for the future of flying? To understand the weight of this moment, we need to look back. How did Boeing and Airbus become the two names that controlled the skies for almost a century? For most of aviation history, you didn't really have a choice. If you were an airline looking for a big passenger jet, the conversation always ended with 2 names, Boeing or Airbus. Boeing came first. Back in the 1950s and 60s, they pioneered the age of jet travel with the legendary 707 and later the iconic 747 jumbo jet. These weren't just planes, they were symbols of modernity. Entire nations built their aviation industries around Boeing's aircraft. But Europe didn't want to be left behind. In the 1970s, Airbus emerged with the A300 and later the A320. That aircraft in particular changed the game. It introduced fly-by-wire technology, making flying more efficient and safer. Suddenly, Boeing had a real rival, and the two began a duel that would define the industry. Fast forward through the decades, and what we see is a duopoly, 2 companies dividing up a trillion-dollar market. Airlines learned to play one against the other, but switching beyond those two was almost unthinkable. Why? Because they controlled not just the planes, but also the parts, the service centers, and the training. It's like buying into an ecosystem. You don't just buy the iPhone, you buy the App Store and everything that comes with it. The result? Airlines sometimes wait 5 to 7 years for delivery slots. Prices remain high. And Boeing and Airbus can bargain hard, knowing airlines don't have many alternatives. Think of it like soft drinks. For decades, if you wanted a cola, it was Coke or Pepsi. Smaller brands existed, but none could challenge the giants at scale. In aviation, Boeing and Airbus became the Coke and Pepsi of the skies. But history shows that no monopoly lasts forever. Every long run of dominance invites a challenger, and in this case, that challenger isn't coming from Europe or North America. It's coming from China. Enter COMAC, the Commercial Aircraft Corporation of China. It didn't appear overnight. This was a project born out of national ambition. For decades, China depended on Boeing and Airbus to carry its people and goods. And for a country that sees itself as a rising superpower, that dependence was unacceptable. So in 2008, Beijing created COMAC with a clear mission: build a homegrown alternative. The flagship? The C919, a single-aisle jet designed to go head-to-head with the Boeing 737 and the Airbus A320, the workhorses of global aviation. On paper, the C919 looks familiar. It seats around 164 to 174 passengers, with a range of about 3,000 to 3,500 miles. Its list price hovers near $90 million. It's powered by LEAP-1C engines, the same engine family trusted by many Western jets. But here's the twist: the C919 isn't entirely Chinese. A large share of its components, engines, avionics, landing gear, come from Western suppliers. This is both a strength and a weakness. Strength, because airlines know these systems are reliable. Weakness, because China isn't yet fully independent in its supply chain. Still, China has worked hard to prove the C919 isn't just an experiment. In 2023, China Eastern Airlines put the first one into commercial service. Since then, flights have been running with dispatch reliability above 98%. Passengers who board say it feels like flying on any modern jet. Quiet, smooth, and normal. And that's exactly the point. No drama, no risk, just a plane that does its job. But the C919 is more than just a plane. It's a statement. It represents China's long game, an industrial strategy to chip away at Western dominance in the one market that seemed untouchable. Which raises a big question. Why would Brazil, a country with its own proud aviation history and a local giant like Embraer, even consider looking east to China for its planes? To understand why a Brazilian airline would look to China, you first have to understand Brazil's unique aviation landscape. Brazil isn't just another country that buys planes. It's home to Embraer, the third largest aircraft manufacturer in the world. Embraer is famous for its regional jets, like the E-Jet series, which are perfect for shorter routes of 70 to 130 passengers. These aircraft dominate Brazil's domestic network, connecting cities spread across vast distances. But here's the gap. Embraer doesn't make a true mainline jet in the same category as the Airbus A320 or Boeing 737. Once you cross into the 150 to 200 seat range, Brazilian airlines are forced to look abroad. And for decades, that meant only two choices: Boeing or Airbus. Take a look at the fleets of Brazil's biggest carriers. Gol operates nearly 150 Boeing 737s. Azul flies both Embraer regionals and Airbus A320neos. LATAM relies heavily on Airbus narrow bodies and Boeing wide bodies for international flights. Everywhere you look, the big names are locked in. But not every airline in Brazil is a giant. Smaller carriers, like Total Aviation, face a different challenge. They don't have the luxury of waiting 5 to 7 years for Boeing or Airbus deliveries. They can't swallow the same high upfront costs. They need flexibility, faster turnaround, and financing that won't drown them in debt. This is where the story shifts. Brazil, despite being an aviation hub, is also a perfect test bed for outsiders. A local industry that covers regionals but leaves a hole in the mid-size market. A geography that demands lots of flights, from dense urban centers like São Paulo and Rio to remote cities deep in the interior, and small carriers looking for affordable, quick solutions. In other words, the conditions were ripe for someone new to slip in, and that's exactly where China spotted an opening. All right, this brings us to the deal that really shook the industry. Total Aviation, a small Brazilian airline, signing up for 4 COMAC C919s. Now, on paper, it doesn't sound all that dramatic. I mean, 4 planes, valued at about $360 million at list price, in a market where Boeing and Airbus count orders by the hundreds. But that's the mistake, looking only at size. Because in aviation, symbolism often matters more than scale. The real story isn't just the aircraft, it's the financing. COMAC, backed by the Chinese state, didn't just sell planes. They offered something Boeing and Airbus rarely can: cheap, flexible financing. Reports suggest up to 80% of the purchase could be covered by loans from the China Development Bank, stretched over 10 to 12 years. For a small airline like Total Aviation, this isn't just attractive, it's a lifeline. Imagine buying a house where the government not only builds it, but also gives you a mortgage with better terms than any private bank. That's the leverage China is playing with. And it wasn't just paperwork. Total Aviation executives were flown to Shanghai, shown COMAC's production lines, walked through simulators, and toured finished C919s. It was as much theater as it was business, a carefully staged demonstration. Look, the plane is real, it's reliable, and will support you every step of the way. By the end, what landed in Brazil wasn't just an order. It was a flag, China planting its marker in South America, right in Boeing and Airbus's backyard. But as every airline knows, buying planes is just the beginning. Money and symbolism don't keep aircraft in the air. The real test is what happens after delivery, when the C919 has to prove itself day after day in Brazil's tough skies. So, what happens when the C919 actually arrives in Brazil? That's where the story gets real. On paper, the C919 is impressive. It's designed to compete head-to-head with the Airbus A320neo and Boeing 737 MAX, carrying about 160 passengers with a range of 5,500 kilometers. Perfect for most of Brazil's busy domestic routes, from São Paulo to Rio or from Brasilia to Manaus. But in aviation, numbers on paper rarely match the grind of daily operations. Airlines care less about brochures and more about two things: reliability and support. That's where COMAC faces its toughest test. Unlike Airbus and Boeing, who have decades of global service centers, spare parts networks, and thousands of planes flying every day, COMAC is starting from scratch. If an engine sensor fails in Manaus, how quickly can COMAC deliver a replacement? If a plane goes down for maintenance, how many days will it sit idle before technicians arrive? Certification is another big hurdle. The C919 is approved in China, but to fly in Brazil, it must clear ANAC, the Brazilian aviation regulator. And even if Brazil gives the green light, most international carriers still look to one standard: approval from the FAA in the US or EASA in Europe. Without those stamps, the C919 may struggle to break into global leasing markets or find secondary buyers. Still, COMAC knows this. That's why the company has paired every aircraft sale with heavy promises: long-term parts support, pilot training programs, maintenance packages, and even technicians stationed abroad. They're trying to build an ecosystem. Fast. It's a gamble, but one worth watching. Because if COMAC can prove the C919 works day in and day out in Brazil's tough conditions, long routes, hot weather, limited infrastructure, it could convince other small airlines across Latin America to take the risk too. And that's when the domino effect starts. Now let's zoom out. Why does Brazil matter so much to China's aviation ambitions? First, geography. Brazil isn't just the biggest country in South America, it's the economic anchor of the entire continent. If you win Brazil, you gain credibility across Latin America. Airlines in Chile, Argentina, Colombia, and Peru all watch Brazil's moves closely because Brazilian carriers often set regional trends. Second, politics. Brazil and China have grown close in recent years. Both are part of the BRICS bloc, both want less dependence on the US and Europe, and both see value in trading directly with each other. For China, getting the C919 into Brazil isn't just a business deal, it's a diplomatic victory. Third, the ripple effect. Latin America is a region where budget airlines are booming. Low-cost carriers are constantly looking for cheaper jets, better financing, and new suppliers. COMAC knows this. If the C919 can prove itself in Brazil, it becomes easier to pitch the plane in Lima, Bogotá, or Santiago. Think of it like soccer. If a player makes it in Brazil, with its passionate fans and competitive clubs, that player can make it anywhere. The same goes for planes. If the C919 succeeds in Brazil, its reputation will skyrocket across the region. But there's also strategy beyond aviation. China doesn't just want to sell planes, it wants to weave Latin America tighter into its economic orbit. From railways in Argentina to ports in Peru and now aircraft in Brazil, every project strengthens China's presence far from its own borders. So this isn't just about a few jets. It's about influence, access, and reshaping global trade routes, one sector at a time. Which leads to the bigger question: if China keeps making moves like this, how will Boeing and Airbus react? In aviation, no airline wants to be the guinea pig, but no one wants to be left behind either. That's where the real danger for Boeing and Airbus begins. Let's say Total Aviation puts its new C919s into service, and they work smoothly. No major delays, no endless maintenance headaches. Suddenly, other small and mid-sized airlines in the region start asking, why not us? Think about it. Airlines in Colombia, Argentina, or Peru are always fighting thin profit margins. If COMAC offers them planes at 15 to 20% cheaper than Airbus or Boeing, plus financing backed by Chinese banks, it's a tempting deal. Even carriers in Africa or Southeast Asia, regions where budgets are tight and growth is fast, will be watching closely. This is how disruption spreads, not in one big leap, but in waves. The first wave is curiosity, airlines observing Brazil's experiment. The second wave is adoption, regional carriers deciding to take the plunge. And the third wave? That's when larger players can no longer ignore COMAC. We've seen this before. In the auto industry, Japanese cars were once dismissed in the 1960s as cheap imitations. A few decades later, Toyota and Honda dominated the global market. The same story played out with South Korea's Hyundai and Kia. At first, buyers laughed them off. Today, they're everywhere. Aviation is harder to crack than cars, but the principle is the same. Once one company proves the product works, others follow. And once enough airlines adopt the C919, Boeing and Airbus will be forced to fight on price, something they've largely avoided for decades. So, the little order from Brazil isn't just about 4 planes. It's the first domino, and if it tips the right way, the whole structure of the aviation industry could start to shift. But this raises the ultimate question. How does this small deal fit into the giant puzzle of global competition between China and the West? What makes this Brazilian deal so fascinating is that it's not just about airplanes. It's about power. China isn't simply selling the C919 to make money. It's part of a much larger playbook-building influence by offering alternatives to Western systems. For decades, the US and Europe have controlled the technologies that make the world run, whether it's aircraft, finance, or digital platforms. China wants to change that. Think about it. In Africa, Chinese companies are building railways and ports. In Asia, they're financing 5G networks. In the Middle East, they're brokering energy deals. And in South America, they're stepping into industries once dominated by American and European firms. Aviation is just the next frontier. This is why Boeing and Airbus can't treat the C919 as just another competitor. It represents a shift in how countries think about who they depend on. If airlines in Brazil, Chile, or Argentina start flying Chinese planes, that's not just an economic decision. It's a geopolitical signal. It tells the world. We don't have to rely on the West anymore. We have other options, and that scares Washington and Brussels. Because if China can break into the skies, a space so heavily guarded by Western dominance, what industry will be safe next? So, while the story began with one small airline in Brazil, the bigger picture is much larger. This is about the balance of power in a world where China is no longer content to play second fiddle. Which brings us to the final piece of the story. Where does this leave the aviation industry, and what does the future of flying really look like? So let's step back for a moment. A tiny Brazilian airline signed a deal for just 4 airplanes. On paper, it's nothing compared to the thousands of jets ordered from Boeing and Airbus every year. But in reality, it's a spark, a signal that the unshakable world of aviation might not be so unshakable after all. For nearly a century, 2 names ruled the skies. Boeing and Airbus set the prices, dictated the waiting times, and built global service networks that locked airlines into their systems. But history shows us something simple. No empire lasts forever. And now, with the C919, China has placed its flag on the runway. The order in Brazil is more than metal and engines. It's about choice. It's about whether smaller airlines and smaller nations can finally escape the stranglehold of 2 giants. And it's about whether passengers like you and me will one day board a flight not on a Boeing or an Airbus, but on something built in Shanghai. Here's the big question. Would you trust it? Would you fly it across the ocean? Because that's what this whole story boils down to. Trust. Trust in a new airplane. Trust in a new supplier. And trust in a new world order where China isn't just a buyer, but a maker. The São Paulo skyline, a Chinese jet on the tarmac, a headline that started small but echoes worldwide. This is the future unfolding in real time. And so I leave you with this. The next time you look up and see a jet slicing through the clouds, ask yourself, what name is written on the side? And how much longer will Boeing and Airbus be the only answer?